welcome everybody. I'm Mercury Black, the lunatic co-host here at Sorting Myself Out. Today I'm joined by my better half, Ryan Holsapple, the proper human being side of our team. And today we're joined by Dr. Gregg Henrique. Did I get that right?
Okay. Henriques, but it's Dan close, so that's good.
Henriques.
Yeah. I'll just call you Gregg for the remainder of this conversation.
That works for me, friend. No problem.
And so the way this came about is Tyler invited me over to the group chat you were having on John Vervaeke's Discord a couple weeks ago, I think, at this point. And I hadn't heard you before that. And I was just immediately impressed. And my thought was, okay, this guy can talk about absolutely anything and be interested. Also, I was the one who had asked you if there was any sort of Dark Night of the Soul experience in your past. Yes. And when you said that not only have you studied and applied yourself very diligently from the intellectual framework, but that you use a little bit of plant medicine to loosen up your thinking, at that point, I shot you the message and thought, okay, I've definitely got to talk to this guy. Now, for those of you in the audience who are used to me, you know that I show up unprepared for everything and that my podcasts are rather chaotic. I did intend to prepare for this one and get caught up on Gregg's work and have been so busy that I haven't. So fortunately, Ryan's going to step in so that Gregg gets better than just my nonsense. We're going to start with a little more structure. And so I'm going to hand it over to you, Ryan, to get us started. And I'll step in with my nonsense at some point.
Fantastic. Okay.
Yeah, so I was able to check out a couple podcasts that you were featured in last night and today, and I just want to see if I can recapitulate some of your tree of knowledge theory. And why I'd like to do it that way is I want to share with you what I understand now, and then what I would love is if you would tell me what I'm missing and what if anything I got wrong, and then what you would add to that. And I'll do it as briefly as possible. And so it's only been about an hour or so of listening to podcasts, so I'm not going to nearly touch the depth of what your work has been. My understanding of the tree of knowledge theory is that it's a unified theory of psychology that also includes all the other sciences, and so it bridges multiple disciplines, and it is based first on the idea that there's a problem of psychology, and it's known by most serious psychologists, which is that there is no agreement on what psychology actually is. And other than it's defined by behavioral and mental processes. But how those processes work or what they are, there's not an agreement on that. And so your goal with this brilliant theory that I've really been enjoying checking out was to try to find the most salient aspects of these different, seemingly sometimes contradicting theories and try to bring them in to a unified understanding of what is psychology and how can we better understand ourselves in the world. And you take an evolutionary view where you look all the way back at matter and the creation of life and all the way to the emergence of consciousness. And you have a kind of a Wilberian aspect to it because it's got that it transcends and includes each level transcends and includes the last one.
Yep.
And what that leaves us with today is we're all the way up to the level of culture, and which is kind of burgeoning into AI. That's kind of what I've got so far.
Okay.
How am I doing so far?
You're doing really well. Excellent. Excellent summary certainly for an hour's worth of listening. Rock and rolling, brother.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear it. And so I want to leave it at that. I could say more about what I heard, but I want to leave it at that and allow you to kind of fill in some of the gaps there. And because I know I'm missing, I know even stuff that I know that I learned, I'm not saying it right now. So I'd love to hear more about.
Right. Would it be helpful? I don't know if you show pictures or anything. Share a screen and show a picture real fast if you wanted to.
Yeah. Do you want to share the picture, or would you like us to do it?
Yeah. Either way, whatever works.
Okay, great. I think Shane, I hope you're here because you're the host of the call, and you're going to have to give Dr. Henriques permission to share his screen. So if you're here, go ahead and do that. If not, then we'll have to edit this part out and keep rolling. Oh, he's going to do it right now. Perfect.
Okay.
And Shane, the way that you do that, in case you're not aware, is you go to share screen, and then you have to click allow multiple participants to share at once. It's pretty easy. You should be able to do it. Done. Okay. You should be good to go.
All right, there it is. Boom. Okay. Bring it on up here. Okay, so you caught a lot of really important things in relationship to the system. Okay, so this is what's called the tree of knowledge. Okay, if you've had any experience like with big history, the big history is a model of thinking about the entire history of the universe, and it starts at the Big Bang. So if you trail the history of time back, it goes into a point. We can talk about what that is. I like to call it a pure energy singularity, okay? And there are many, many big picture views of the universe, and virtually all of them have two axes, the time axis from past to present, and the complexity axis, which is the vertical axis, okay? And that's what big history does, and there are many other views of cosmic evolution that explore the evolution of things on the scales of time and complexity. Tree of knowledge carries that axis, two-axis model, but it adds these four cones, as four different dimensions of behavioral complexity or different dimensions of existence. And that's a pretty important distinction in how to think about these concepts. Mm-hmm. And so what it says is that first, out of matter came space, time, energy, and matter, and created this massive field that we map with quantum mechanics, general relativity, and Newton's theories, and then into chemistry as things get increasingly more complex in their organization. And that happened on planet Earth, the surface of planet Earth, say 4 billion years ago. And so for the first 10 billion years, there was an evolution of the dimension of the matter dimension of complexity, which is shown here. And then, as far as we are aware, at least on planet Earth, there was an explosion of life. And life is a fundamentally different kind of thing, and I can talk about exactly why. But the short way to describe it is that whereas matter is a bunch of complicated stuff that happens with pretty clear linear cause and effect, okay? Life is a bunch of complex adaptive things that process information, communicate, and try to achieve their goals. And that creates a fundamentally different kind of organization. So what you have with life is you have the stored information in genes around the DNA, and then it computes, transfers into RNA, and that computes and transfers into protein mechanisms surrounded in a lipid structure that creates a membrane where it takes in information, energy, and matter to organize and move, okay? And then they engage in cell-cell communication, and ultimately about 2 billion years ago, we get multicellular creatures in the form of plants and other kinds of elements. And that's this evolution over this 3 billion year period where we went from single cells to multi-cells in creatures like trees and plants and things like that. Okay? Mm-hmm. Then what happens at about 550 years ago, it's called the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion in evolution is when we had simple animals, kind of like jellyfish and combs, and these are simple distributed neural network creatures that drift along like with the water, but they're not really independent movers, okay? But with the Cambrian explosion, you get an explosion of complex active bodies and brains encased in the front of a head that then serve as a computational control system that is emergent over the cell structure. So now you get cells linking cells together in the form to create the behavior of a sensory motor behavior of the animal as a whole. And we actually, in this language system, that is called the dimension of mind. So this actually, you have to learn how to talk a little differently, but mind is actually something that you see. If you see a fly avoiding your fly swatter, you are witnessing mind with a capital M, okay? Which basically means that you're seeing the behavior of the animal as a whole, mediated by a brain that's engaged in a complex adaptive way, okay? And insects fall under that, mollusks like octopuses, and of course all the vertebrates fall under that, all right? Now, one of
the lowest, lowest form of life that you would consider having mind.
Right, the lowest. So basically, like a planaria, they've mapped like the 302 neurons of a. It's a bilateral worm system that has a brain and moves around. So that's essentially right at the base of the mind. Right underneath that are comb jellies with distributed neural nets that don't have a brain. Okay, so essentially you get a planaria bilateral structure, and that sets the stage for the real base. But really, they don't have a complex adaptive body. Things really change behaviorally when you get a complex adaptive body, like an insect body. Okay, then you get much more complicated behavior. The behavior of bees is very, very different than the behavior of plants. And even though plant behavior is very complicated, but bees, as they get a hive together and they do all the things they do, it's really remarkable. Okay. And we call that mind because what you're looking at is mental behavior. People use the term behavior all the time, but it's a special kind of animal behavior. So if you watch a cat fall out of a tree, some of that behavior is because of physical behavior called gravity. And some of it, as it lands and runs away, that's mental behavior. Okay. Now, the psychologists made a horrible error and they called that behavior. They should have called it a particular kind of behavior because that's really what we're interested in. And then the tree of knowledge gets this right, and it says it's mental behavior that the psychologist is interested in, okay, in trying to understand, describe, and explain. And the way we understand, describe, and explain it is through the information processing system of the nervous system. So the nervous system, what is it? It's an information processing computational control system. So the nervous system is very much like the DNA, RNA of a cell, okay, only at the meta level of the entire structure. So it pulls cells together and communicates so that the whole animal now can move, okay? And that's mental, and we see the evolution of the animal kingdom from about 700 million years ago. So about 5 million years ago, you had complicated primates wandering around that were similar in complexity to modern day chimpanzees, okay? And then what we see over the last, million years, and then in particular, an accelerating rate of change over the last 100,000 years and 50,000 years and 10,000 years, is we see this last dimension called the culture person dimension of existence, okay? This is the exact same basic principle where now we have minds that are getting yoked together by language, okay? So now my subjective mental system, all our minds are getting connected by this conversation. And culture is the process by which symbolic information processing and networked communication gets together, and that gives rise to a whole nother complex adaptive plane of existence, which is the culture person plane. And indeed, what turns you from a primate when you're born into a cultured person is that you learn to talk and that you learn to justify your actions on the social stage and take self-conscious reflective responsibility for that. That's actually what a conscious person is. And that's what makes us quite different than all the other animals. It's hard to get your dog to justify why it did what it did. Even though it has a very complex mental life, it doesn't have a cultured system of justification, okay? And then out of that, one of the things the Tree of Knowledge does is it tells you what kind of things that cultures produce ultimately through these information processing systems, and they produce these systems of justification. Then you trail the system of justification through our indigenous systems of justification, pre-modern civilization. Then civilization gives you a pre-modern formal system of justification. Then you get a modern scientific system, and that's what this represents. So and science is a particular kind of system of justification that actually tries to factor out the biases of the knower and then tries to map the reality. So science is part of culture, but it also kind of emerges out of culture and then functions to map. So this is all of our scientific theories about the ontic reality called matter. And these are our biological theories, which actually exist in culture about life. And these are our psychological theories about mind and so forth, okay? So this 4-dimension or 4 planes of existence is really key. And what it does is it allows you to differentiate, create a lens of understanding that allows you to differentiate. And my work is showing, like right here, you know how big a theory, Darwin's theory of evolution is, the evolutionary synthesis? Oh my God, that's unbelievably important. Well, if almost everyone kind of agrees that this is kind of a joint point, but if you take the Tree of Knowledge seriously, it's like we're missing 2 Darwin theories of evolution. Each one of these should be a massive focus of attention in theoretical understanding. But because psychology is so confused, we've screwed it all up. And the tree of knowledge system says, hey, we should be focused on the jump from life to mind, okay? And that should be a whole set of problems. And then we should be focused on the jump from mind to culture. That's a whole nother set of problems. And if we had gigantic evolutionary theories, we would then be able to stack all of these and have a biological, psychological, social, systemic understanding.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And how do you define culture? Can you run me through a brief way that you would define it?
Great question. Yeah. So right, the tree of knowledge then gives rise to this different language game. So you have to understand, just like the periodic table of the elements, everything comes with its own language game. So the tree of knowledge says, hey, just like I mentioned the term mind, you have to understand what capital M mind means. So it's a great question. Capital C culture means something very specific. Okay. What it means is the systems of justification that people build when they create propositions that they network together to then create systems that legitimize what is and ought to be. That's the short answer for it. And then operate at a scale so that you and I can have a dyadic system of justification that coordinates our behavior. And then that sits in a community, and then that community sits in a state level for modern society, and then that sits in large scale systems. So Christianity is a system of justification. Science is a system of justification. Okay?
Right. And so you end up with something similar to the picture of the hands drawing themselves, where culture is now creating the narrative about nature, but nature is giving rise to this ability to have culture, right? So it's
Amen. Amen. Yeah. And you can use that circular hand to think about our own identities too, so that people are scripted and sculpted like an Escher diagram by the culture they're born into. And yet, of course, as you become an adult and make claims, Greta Thunberg or whatever claim you make, okay, Trump, you then shape the influential influence makers then shape the systems of justification. I mean, right now, Black Lives Matter, all of these things then are constant iterative processes by which individuals then take leads, become influenced, justify systems, okay? And to think, it is important to differentiate capital C culture from society. So society is the totality of culture, capital C. These are the beliefs and values that coordinate people. Then you have our technology, what I call material culture in the language of the TOK. So material culture is like your rocks and your plants and your buildings and stuff like that, tables and stuff, okay? You also have your practices, which are behavioral investments, which is also part of the mind dimension. So like, do you know how to play basketball? Okay, so playing basketball isn't a justification, that's a behavioral investment practice. And then you have the biophysical ecology in which you live. So if you live near the Sahara Desert on the Nile versus living in the Arctic, makes all the difference in the world in terms of the kinds of structures you'll build. So culture is your justification system. Society, the whole kit and caboodle, includes material culture, the buildings and technologies we build, and the behavioral practices, and then you place that in the physical ecology.
And so what I had asked about capital M mind, like that you'd said, sort of the bottom is the planarian. With the capital C culture, what would be the example of where that first emerged? What was the most primitive capital C culture?
Great. And so this is actually, right here is the first jump into what launched me into this journey in 1996, okay? And gave rise to the justification hypothesis into what's called justification systems theory. If you go back to the diagram, you'll see the joint point between mind and culture, and the base of culture is called justification systems theory, okay? And this is the launch, the whole damn thing. So I'm in 1996, it gets back to your issue, Ryan. So actually, my problem as a graduate student started not so much in the problem of psychology per se, but in the problem of psychotherapy, okay? So psychotherapy, I'm a clinician, so it's like somebody comes in and they got all the problems, and you start talking with them, and somehow your conversations are supposed to help them. I don't know how the hell, but it does. I was learning how the hell it did, and I was learning about all the different approaches that people used. And I found them all, when they were crafted right by people that I respected, they all had really good insights. But then the question was, well, if you trail them back to their suppositions and their values and their language systems and their primary theories, what are called in the academic language, the paradigms, they didn't talk to each other at their core. And then I was like, well, actually, why doesn't psychotherapy be organized by psychology? And that's when I asked, well, what is psychology? And then I was I was actually in the path of what's called evolutionary psychology, and that got me into a big picture evolutionary view. But then I realized that evolutionary psychology wasn't up to the task, and I had stumbled into this insight. So I was being trained in psychoanalytic, psychodynamic therapy. That's, kind of modern Freudian stuff. And I was getting also trained, my dissertation advisor, I was working on a cognitive therapy model. So that's like Aaron T. Beck and Albert Ellis. I don't know if your audience knows anything about psychotherapy, but anyway, cognitive is a big branch. and I was learning about this evolutionary stuff. And this is coming right back to your question now, Mercury. Okay, so everyone who looks at the issue sees, I think virtually everyone, sees human language as a symbolic language, as this really unique communication system, okay? Other animals communicate, but most people agree that the full package with human language is really intense, and when we have that, it changes the equation, because we can store information, transmit it super easy, and then intergenerationally learn, okay? And then if you get the cumulative evolution of cultures, this intergenerational learning. So all the evolutionary theorists are focused on, well, what were the preconceived notions that would set the stage for language, and then once it happened, then it would take off and that'd be all good, and that's what makes us so smart and efficient and make all these tools and all this other shit. Great, and I more or less agree with that. But here's what I noticed, okay? I noticed that the evolution of language created this very, very interesting problem. Once it transitioned from broken proto-language, and I'll be clear about what I mean by that, into a full-fledged propositional system. Okay, what's broken proto-language? Broken proto-language is antelope there, okay? It's gesturing, it's symbols, but they're not tied together to create a propositional structure, all right? So we just say antelope there, we go over there, and blah, blah, blah. Notice that antelope there is not a propositional meaning statement, okay? But when I say there are the antelope, all right, now I've yoked it together into a propositional meaning statement, and you can say, well, how do you know? Okay, all right. What that means is propositional meanings carry with them this potential pressure, what I call the problem of justification, all right? Any propositional statement that carries meaning can then be questioned as to why. Why do you know that's the case? Why are we talking about it now? Okay. And actually questioning is really easy to do. It doesn't take a lot of cognitive hardware to ask questions. Hang out with a 3 to 4 year old precocious kid. Okay. Why are you bald, Dad? Why is the sky blue? Why don't we eat cookies now? You know, they just, why? You know, Jesus, I don't know, because I told you so. You know, right? So it's not that hard to ask questions. As any exasperated parent will tell you, it's often hard to answer. And the problem is, how do you justify your propositions? All right. So this got me into a really interesting problem, which basically started to say, well, you know what? Our whole reasoning structure would have been centered around this dialogical problem of justification. All right. All right. And indeed, there's an enormous amount of evidence to suggest that's exactly right. Okay. In other words, we reason as to see what's justifiable in a context. All right. I saw that, and then I had another insight, which really then comes back to Mercury's question, because this is what hooks the whole thing and ties together the Escher comment I made before. So what I realized is it's not just the problem of social justification. It's not just the problem of justification. It's the problem of social justification. What's social justification? Social justification is coming up with explanations and reasons that take into account your social influence, okay? Whereby, how do you decide what the hell you're going to share about what you really think, depending on people's status and relationships and everything else, okay? So if I'm your boss and I came in, you've been slacking off, and I'm like, well, what have you been doing? Well, I've been looking around other stuff here, okay? In other words, I have an example where I was working on this problem and I was sharing it with students. I was 20 minutes late. My wife had already been late, so she was justifiably pissed at me. I was trying to get home. There was 5 minutes of traffic, and I get home at 6:30. My wife said, well, where have you been? This is before the days of cell phones. And the first thing I said is, this traffic. And I wasn't even thinking about it, right? I didn't say, hey, honey, I know your time's valuable, but actually I really cared about talking to this and my friends, and I was really interested in the justification idea, and sorry, I didn't really care about your time. I didn't say that, but my behavior. said that, okay? I said, oh, I'm sorry, it's traffic. I couldn't do anything about it. In other words, I attached the explanation to account for things to provide a justification for events that took my social influence into account, okay? So what that means is that now not only do you have a reason-giving system that solves the problem of social justification in a social context, you have a social justifying interpretive system, okay, that looks into your self-conscious, looks into inside of you, considers the rules and social environment, and then develops a rational, plausible story that takes that into consideration and paints yourself generally in the best light, okay?
Right.
So the last thing I'll say is actually what I just described is Sigmund Freud's fundamental observation.
Right.
So Sigmund Freud, in his structural model, saw that we had a biopsychological id. In other words, we had selfish shit going on inside of here, all right? We lived out here in a superego that had all these rules that said, you better behave like your parents, you better get pressured, and if you're not a good boy, we're gonna be, and now you had an ego that's basically, oh shit, how do I deal with my sex and aggression in a rule-based Victorian context and justify it so that I manage reality?
Right. And then to Freud, it didn't matter so much to the ego if it was right or wrong. It was about doing it in a way that was acceptable so that you could get your needs met, right?
That's right. So Freud said that you had a self-consciousness system that essentially repressed shit that you couldn't justify and rationalized shit that you could. You know,
right.
Rationalizing function. And this said, well, not Freud's great at all, sees crazy theories in many ways, but this provides a very pristine evolutionary, it's called a reverse engineering analysis, okay? So to get back to your point, Mercury, what actually started happening? People started talking. Talking gave rise to propositions. Propositions gave rise to justifications. Then we were flowing. And then we were building more and more systems of justification. And we were dealing with the problem of why and how and what, and then who the hell were we as other people said, well, why are you doing what you're doing? And that then took off the dimension of culture.
Wow. I have a couple of things. One is I've been blessed with a great mentor in psychology who always tells me human beings are the only species that do whatever the hell they want to do at any given moment and then make up reasons why.
Okay.
Yeah, his name's Dr. Roger Strachan. But the other thing is that I wanted to tie in here is that it seems to me what you call culture is simultaneously serving as a noun and a verb. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's totally fair. It depends on the context in which you want to use it. Absolutely.
Okay, great. The other thing is a lot of what you just shared is very similar to stuff I've read in Jonathan Haidt's work about post hoc rationalizations. Your story about coming home, blaming it on it's the traffic, when really maybe you had other motivated reasoning going on. So it sounds like what you're proposing is that this is so human that we constantly justify our actions, regardless of whether or not that justification is actually the reason that we did it.
Completely. Yeah, I went over to, I knew John, but when he was at the University of Virginia, he and I, which is only about an hour from where I was, and I learned about his social intuition model, which is, he published that in 2001. I contacted him like in 2004, and he and I had some correspondence. I went over there, had dinner with him. I presented my justification system to his lab. I would have preferred a citation in his Reicher's Mind book, but you know, I understand. That's cool.
Oh, wow. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, you definitely deserve a citation because the way you described it was very, very articulate and makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, fair enough. And his structure, John's a, great guy and fascinating, and influential guy and all that. So it's a little needle I offer, but that's it. That's all.
Yeah, I understand. So when we take this model to the level of the individual and for example, maybe a psychological experience with a client or something, like how does this conceptualization help the clinical work? And then also where do you see this going as far as the theoretical evolution and the natural conclusion of the model, and what are the and these are huge questions, so you pick wherever you want, but what are
those are two let me if I can continue to share my screen, I'll come back to this. Okay. So this is a slide deck on the unified theory. All right. Okay, so now what this is this is an articulation of justification systems. We see here it's at the base of culture, okay, and should be the organizing framework for the social sciences in theory. So this would be the underlying structure of human psychology, which then would form the base of political science, even market behavior, especially through, and anthropology and sociology. That's what should be happening. That's how big an idea it is. Okay. But now, relative to human psychology and psychotherapy, what it does is it provides what's called the updated tripartite model of human consciousness. So the tripartite model is id, ego, superego,
right.
Which is useful, but it's also built in Freud. I mean, Freud's a turn of the century guy. He didn't know what the fuck was going on, okay, at many levels. So what this is this says, all right, so what do you actually have here is you have an experiential self. Right? This is your core phenomenology. It's more right brain. It's holistic, perspectival, and it's very much organized by emotion. Okay? So this is your intuitive sense of feeling in the world. So you're perceiving your drive system, your feeling system. Okay? And what will come on the screen of your consciousness at a pictorial and affective level. All right? Through what's called the attentional filter. That's how you have an unconscious system. And then there's also always competition about what can get put on the screen. And then it gets placed on the screen, kind of like your working memory perceptual system. And then you see stuff in your head and you have feelings about it. Okay. So then you have your private narrator, okay, which starts off as a pretty weak system. Doesn't really even come on. It has to come online with language. So when you're 2, 3, and 4, not that big a deal. It really gets solidified into an operating system that judges and corresponds you over time in adolescence. In fact, that's the major process of adolescence, is that you actually now have a private self-concept identity function that then is regulating this question, well, who the hell am I relative to all my friends in the 8th grade? You know, and most of us know that's a fucking nightmare question, but you know, you start asking it at that time. And you really have the abstract ability to see, well, who do I want to be? Who am I going to be with my parents? Who am I going to be with my friends? And you start to really get this solidified self-concept. And you have the public self. This is what you decide to tell other people, okay? And this filtering, and this filtering can be either a way in which you hide stuff, you create omissions, create narrative, or actively lie. In fact, virtually all kids, about 3 or 4, start learning to lie, and then how parents deal with that lying is very, very, very important to understand. So the updated, you ask about clinic stuff. So what this says is, well, this tells you how to understand in an updated fashion the kinds of problems, for example, that people will have. So I deal with, it's the disharmony between what your actions get you, what your feeling tells you, what your narrator are, and how you live in the public stage. Mm-hmm. I'll give a classic example, which probably can resonate. So I went to high school in the 80s. And although we weren't vicious about it, we didn't have the same LGBTQ enlightenment that we have now. So one of my friends, we'd be hanging around talking about, all of our feelings about women and getting dates and, see what's going on. He was always lukewarm about that. Okay. Well, what happened over the time is that, ultimately he then comes out to himself that he was gay. All right. And then in late end college, he comes out of the closet. All right. What happened to him? Well, he internalized originally a private narrator. He would be getting drives and feelings about homosexual images, but early at 14, 15, his private narrator would say, oh shit, I can't have that. Mm-hmm. So he would try to disconnect from those feelings. That's what's called the Freudian filter. He'd be in denial. He'd repress, avoid that stuff because it's punitive, because the internalized parent is going to tell you, oh my God, he had a dad that was pretty homophobic. Okay. So you get out of your own self-awareness. So you engage in self-deception to say, yeah, I think she's cute. And then you really, I don't know what I think. Okay. Right. And then eventually there's enough safety and enough awareness, and it reaches a threshold. And then all of a sudden you come out to yourself, which basically means the private narrator says, yes, I've been repressing all this, and now I'm going to allow myself, if it's really there, I'm going to see it. And then of course it all comes flooding in, and you see it and you say, oh my God, this is really what I am. Okay. But then you hide it from other people because you're terrified that other people will judge you, and then you come out of the closet. Okay, with the public filter. Now, what this shows you is the kind of dynamics then between systems. So as a clinician, I can look at you, if you're working with you, I'll be able to track your body. I'll be able to track your experiential system. I'll be able to track your private narrator, and I'll listen to your history, so I'll be able to understand what kind of judgmental experiences you had with others, and that will help me understand what your filtering dynamics are across your levels of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
That's fascinating. I love that diagram. And as you went through like the process with the person about their sexuality, it got me thinking, and like my expertise on the channel is that I'm extremely insane. I'm bipolar type 1 with psychotic features, and through extended isolation and spiritual practices, meditation, and all kinds of ridiculous nonsense, I've learned to control my condition on my own. I'm not using medication or anything. And it makes me wonder if, when I got hit by the bus, like to just put everything into your framework for a moment, and that when I became bipolar from that framework, it almost seems to me like the things that were below, and sorry, could you put the image back up for a second?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Like your terms again?
Mm-hmm.
Things that were below the attention filter seem to have forced themselves up into the experiential self. And the total psychosis to me must be a lot of things that were once beneath the attention filter. And when it was in the experiential self, but I couldn't allow it to move to my private self, because I went through the first 6 years was wanting, like, I couldn't accept that I was insane. So I was trying to get back to normal, whereas at a certain point I went, okay, that's not a fucking option. I'm going to try to be the best lunatic. That was the point at which I allowed everything forced into my experiential self to all be present in my private self. And then I see now that probably my participation in this channel over the last year and a half is me gradually moving everything across the Rogerian filter to now exposing all of this that I've developed in the private self out into the public world.
Brilliantly said. So and this is a model of, just for clarity, so this is a model of your consciousness, okay? Your brain and the neurocognitive processes behind that stage are operative, that then give rise to the emergence of the stage of experience. So if you're bipolar, so classic narrative around bipolar 1, now there's a wide variety of bipolar 1 narratives, so I won't presume that this applies to you, but let me be clear about what a bipolar 1 classic presentation is. Okay?
Yeah, and don't worry about offending me personally.
Oh yeah, no, I can tell you're cool with wherever the hell you are.
Yeah.
That's good, right? So you actually have to have the relationship of your narrator and your true self, and figure out some fucking harmony between that, right? And come to terms with what you are. And we all struggle with that, and that's a journey of life kind of deal, because that narrator wants you to be, for your dad and for the society, wants you to be a particular way, and then how do you deal with that shit? And that's welcome to the therapy shadow work. I mean, it's a hell of a process. So, but in terms of what bipolar is, so to understand another part of the theory, all right, is to understand behavioral investment theory. So behavioral investment theory, this is the part between life and mind. So this is the base of what the nervous system is organized to do. And what it is it's a behavioral investment system, okay? So in other words, it orients you to spend energy towards certain things, okay? And conserve energy and avoid certain shit. That's the basic animal problem, all right? So what does that mean? It means your psychic energy system has a positive active system, okay? And it's actually got an active passive system and a positive and negative system, okay? Well, what happens with bipolar classically, in a classic manic, is a feedback loop on positive active. So the core of positive active gets charged. So normally what you get charged to do is you're now trying to achieve a goal state. So oh, that's sexy, or oh, I want to eat that, or oh, I want to take that risk. So that energizes you. Now, normally what happens is when you get energized towards a particular goal, that hits you, and then you have calm, relaxation, satisfaction, okay? And then you go back to baseline, so you get passive activation. Well, that doesn't happen when you're bipolar. One goal leads to another goddamn goal. And one next goal leads to another. It's actually an epileptic kind of fit, and in fact, you take a lot of your bipolar meds or anti-epileptic medications. And so what that does is What the system does is spirals out of control. It's called a positive feedback loop cybernetic wise. But anyway, what it goes boom, boom, boom. And you just like, you go from hypomanic, and then you go into phase 1, and you go to phase 2, and you start blowing up. And then obviously, you know, crazy happen. You know, but yeah, that system. And then eventually what happens is it goes, and then it shuts off. I've got a whole model of depression, which is a state of behavioral shutdown. Eventually, this system runs out of gas, short circuits, pulls the plug, and you go crashing into a massive depressive state where everything is about conservation, passivity, and negativity. And you drive yourself into a dark channel. And that split between those two poles, well, anyone goes crazy with that level, with that level of fragmentation. It's intense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's still what I ride now. So it's not like I become less insane. It's that I've adapted myself to this. And my first 2 cycles were actually 3 years, where the mania would build for up to a year and go fully into the complete psychosis.
Okay.
My will. Then 2 years of depression. But it's matched up now. Like as soon as I made the split to not fighting that I'm insane, but to be all right, like let's be the best madman we can be. That was when I switched over, and I've naturally lined up with the seasons here. And I'm in Quebec, so spring. And actually, I look at both frameworks. I've got atheist subpersonalities. I've got this messianic, you know, I've got the whole mix. And I examine it all, and I know that I don't know which is true. But one framework that I've enjoyed applying to it or being aware of, as well as everything that you've said, is in the really, really old religions, the early forest god, which was the first male deity, like the first feminine goddess of fertility, she was eternal, whereas the male god was born every spring, lived throughout the summer. In the fall, his antlers would fall off, and in the winter, he died every year, and then was born again every spring. And so I found it matches up with that and allows me to live a very shamanic life. And to feel that there's actually, for me now at least, there's a purpose to that whole swing, because there's lessons to be learned in the dark and lessons to be learned in the light. And there's a time to be active and manic and full of energy. And there's a time to cry and sleep a lot for me. And I embrace the entire experience now and try to find something productive for each case.
Well, that's beautiful, because I mean, essentially, according to the unified theory, the challenge is how do you organize your action system with your feeling system and your thinking system and your relationship system. Okay, so in other words, how the hell are you're gonna have these action systems that are gonna organize your feelings in a particular way, and then your self-consciousness system is gonna battle those things if they're out of whack. All right, and then people carry all the fucking tension that they have and live in a social world where they're judging them, because you have to be can't be crazy, you know, you gotta be normal or whatever. So you deal with all of that tension, and the fighting around that tension is where an enormous amount of psychopathology happens. It's maladaptive psychopathology. So what I try to do is I try to help people layer those structures and try to find harmony across them. And that's what it sounds like you've actually figured out a way to do. How do I figure out a way, my spiritual belief system, my relationship system, my narrative, when is my emotional and action systems going to do the things that they're going to do? Okay. And then how do I at least channel them without going off the guardrails, but channel them in a way that channels that energy in its most adaptive way possible. So it sounds like you've done a brilliant job of that.
And for me, though, I had to get rid of a pressure that most, you know, patients you deal with can't get rid of. Is I saw the opportunity to completely sever societal expectation for me.
Okay.
So for instance, the government, after my second breakdown, it was so bad that the government was like, you know, it's cheaper to give you permanent disability than to be dealing with this nonsense. So I was put on permanent disability, and I moved. I didn't tell friends where I was going. I got a place right near my parents out in the country, and they dropped off all my supplies, and I went into isolation. The first 2 years, no phone, no internet, no car, no visitors other than my parents. And then I gradually opened up. But even here, somehow I've managed to get this space online, where also there's no societal pressure for me here either. I, to a certain degree, use lunatic like a shield. Like both in society society said, hey, sure, like you just go do whatever nonsense if it keeps you quiet and non-destructive. But also by showing up really authentic and honestly this way, there's no societal expectation.
Right.
On it.
Well, actually, that brings up another one. I mean, not to be throwing stuff around, but okay, so this thing.
Throw it around.
So this thing's called the influence matrix. This is the underlying structure for managing your relationship system. All right. What it says is that we're all born with a desire for high relational value. This is being known and valued by important others. And we're terrified about being devalued, disrespected, rejected, criticized. Okay. And this is what's called the RVSI black line of social influence. All right. And what it basically says is that we're navigating, trying to get relational value and avoid low relational value on 3 dimensions of power. This vertical dimension where we try to climb up on our rank and social status. This could be either in terms of active dominance over somebody and like, okay, I'm your boss, or more indirect dominance in relationship to prestige, what psychologists generally call achievement. Then you have love, which is how do you form affiliations and defend against them if other people are going to take advantage of you. And then finally, you have the dependency, which is, oh my God, I got to fuse with other people, versus autonomy, which is going to totally separate. And the far end of autonomy is called counterdependence, okay? So what you went through in this framework is because things are so crazy with other people, right? And then they were trying to control you and you're out of there. It's basically, all right, I got to take a hyper-autonomous counterdependent route. All right, I have to basically, I just take care of myself. Other people are like, all right, go, or whatever. I don't know what the hell they were saying exactly. But you unplugged because of the chaos associated with trying to maintain relational exchanges. And we're able to then find, through a counter-dependent strategy, you're able to then find yourself in relationship to that.
Mm. Wow.
Man, I'm so glad Tyler invited me to come listen to you the other week. And then we ended up doing this. I'm having a fantastic time.
Good.
Ryan, do you want to cut in there? I was dominating attention for a while.
Sure. One thing that comes up for me is, so when you are looking at these models that include various aspects of human response to the social environment, and basically you're saying, like, here are some very typical ways that people will adapt, whether it's maladaptive or functionally adaptive.
Sure.
How do you account for genetic variation within the psychological domain, as in the uniqueness that, because one critique I have against developmental theory, some of them at least, is that they can err on the blank slate side a little bit. So I'm just curious what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, so I mean, my system doesn't really have any nature-nurture. It's different than the nature-nurture structure, that it really, whatever the old dichotomies about nature and nurture,
Yes,
it doesn't really apply.
they don't apply.
They don't really apply. I mean, what you have, certainly, so for example, I mean, Mercury is almost certainly going to get a genetic predisposition that's going to set up his behavioral activation system, okay, to be triggered. Now, did his development set that up and make him more vulnerable? Well, you'd have to look at his development. That's the bipolar 1's got a pretty high genetic load, so he's probably carrying a particular vulnerability. But all of what for him to be a person, he had to realize his experience. All of us are individuals, so we're actually all vectors of development. Okay.
Yes.
Be very clear that what are you talking about when you're talking about these concepts of heritability? People don't understand how complicated it is to be talking at the level of population heritability, okay?
Yes.
And the genetic development of an individual that has a manifestation.
Right.
I see shit all the time where people are like, well, the heritability is high, so therefore it was biologically fixed. It's like,
right.
That's actually completely insane and not at all the way in which you understand how it works.
Right.
So there's an enormous number of unfortunate errors. What I will say, certainly, is that there are pretty clear genetic variations that set the stage for certain kinds of development. Okay?
Yes.
So, people are, if you have 2 IQ parents that have IQs in the 130s, the chances of you having a kid that's set up to develop to get an IQ in the 80s is small. And of course, he gets hit by a head or has something happen to his brain system, and boom,
Right.
Okay, so you definitely have these biogenetic differences. In fact, one of the principles of behavioral investment theory is the principle of behavioral genetics. Okay, and that is that if you understand where the parent set points were, that almost always accounts for variation in population levels. Okay, so if your parents super extroverted, you're probably going to be pretty extroverted. In fact, it's more shaped by that. And this is one of the things that's really striking, and we're still figuring this out. Then your traits, your personality traits, are almost not influenced at all by your upbringing, which is kind of interesting.
Right. That's kind of what I'm getting to. And that's one of the things that I've been sort of obsessed with here over the last several months is looking at some of that research. But it sounds like what you're saying is that for the model that you're talking about, you've reached a point where that dichotomy of nature and nurture has no relevance because it's so much more complicated than that. That conversation isn't even, so there's no reason to continue that conversation because it's clearly a feedback where both things are important. Is that correct?
Right. Well, yeah, and the way in which things are defined. Like, for example, what the hell do you mean by nurture? So if you understand, if you understand the tree of knowledge, you realize that you have a genetic behavioral, you have a genetic event that happens at conception. And
yes.
What genetically got stored was the intergenerational development of your evolutionary history. Okay.
Yeah.
Then there's conception. Now you started. Now you're on your trail of development. Now and so then people think about, well, that's nurture. Well, actually, no.
Right.
Or yes, but it's so many different kinds of nurture that you got to be clear. The tree of knowledge tells you right away, well, there's nurture at the level of physiology.
Yes.
So this is now, what are you actually drinking and eating? What's the toxicology of your environment? What's the damn temperature that you grow up in? How is your cells engineering themselves to build you as a biological being? That's
right.
an epigenetic physiological development.
Yes.
Okay? So is that nature? I mean, but that's all biology.
It's all nature, right?
Well, then that's what I would say. I would say it's physiological onto genetic nature, but at the level of biology.
Right.
But people think about nature as biology. Well, I mean,
right.
There's nature at the level of learning and development. That's the level of the behavior of the animal as a whole. That's your perceptual sensory motor system, what you get exposed to, what you see other people do, what your association and operant conditioning systems are, and then how you make decisions that build schematic knowledge. And then there's your cultural system of justification.
Yeah.
On top of that. So that's a culture, mind, life. Each of those are developmental trails. They each have complex adaptive feedback loops, all existing in systems. All right. So yes, we can do interesting behavioral genetic studies to determine heritability about certain kinds of traits. Okay. Yeah. But the way public interprets what those heritability coefficients actually means is basically bullshit. They then take the concept, they then try to use them as justification tools, and they screw it up horribly, mostly because we, psychologists and experts, don't have a great model, and we get all confused between ourselves and then hand it to the public, and it's a disaster.
Right. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. So the disagreements within the field, along with the way that it gets put out there by the media, it really creates a confusing dynamic with this whole genetic and personality thing. So I just out of my curiosity, if you were to explain it to somebody who isn't studying psychology in a very simple way that is steel-manned instead of straw-manned, how would you do that?
Well, what you want to basically do is you want to help the person realize that you have that we can think about genetic biases, tendencies, and dispositions when we're interested in what are called individual differences. Okay, and individual differences are the ways in which the concepts that you are like some other people, generally on a normal distribution. Okay.
Yep.
There are big ways in which there are ability sets, like intellectual ability, music ability, athletic ability, okay? There are dispositional trait sets like extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, okay? And these, a dispositional behavioral set and a dispositional ability set, as well as some dispositional vulnerabilities, particular kinds of challenges like bipolar, okay? Learning disabilities. These are all individual differences, and you will inherit a behavioral set. Inside of a particular culture, you have to contextualize it to have meaning in a culture.
Right.
Inside a particular history that will influence you. Okay. All right. Now, like for me, we could say that, yes, if you looked at my parents, okay, if I said, hey, my parents are 7 foot tall basketball players, or my parents are 2 PhDs, okay? Turns out my 2 PhDs, not 7-foot football basketball players, okay? You look at me, that's not surprising.
Right.
So you do inherit certain kinds of qualities and dispositions, tendencies that then have to be realized. Okay,
they're tendencies. They're not cast in concrete.
They're not cast in stone.
That's where people go. They go right.
But
they go the other direction and say it's all bullshit and everything how you're raised, right? So there's both. There's a straw man on both sides.
Straw man's on both sides. Mercury.
Yeah. Would a metaphor for what you guys were just saying sort of be like the genetic is the equivalent of a blueprint, but that doesn't always mean the house ends up that way?
Well, that's a very good reasonable. Some people point out that there's actually now it's like a blueprint that evolves actually with your experience. It's interesting. They used to think of what's called the central dogma of biology was a blueprint model back in the 1950s, whereby they thought that the information was static and then would deliver what the RNA into proteins were done. But actually now you can turn genes on off based on experience, like which ones get activated. So it's actually a living blueprint, okay? And it does orient you to be channeled in a particular direction that then tends to happen on, again, individual difference variables, okay? Right. So for me, I say, like most important thing in my life other than my family and the fact that I built this unified theory. Now, this unified theory, this is an individual difference, okay? That in other words, it's meaningless to talk about that in terms of behavioral genetics. So what that means is that there are an enormous number of things that are completely irrelevant for behavioral genetics, okay? So you have to have lots of clarity about the subset of things that are relevant. You have to understand that these are aggregate heritable constructs that are relevant for individual difference constructs, which are different than our individual lives. Individual difference are different. So there's all this nuance that the field tends to not get right, and then you hand it with people that are trying to make sense out of shit. It's just
and I really appreciate you going down the rabbit hole with me here because it's one of the things that I'm personally interested in. I know that not all of our audience is like, oh, why did Ryan want to go down the rabbit hole on genetics again? But and Robert Plowman, one of the leaders in this field, has said that they're probabilistic, not deterministic. They're not
right. Well, that's a dispositional bias concept. Absolutely, right. Everyone that knows anything that thinks about it, it's genes never do one-to-one hardly anything. It's all mediated through a developmental process that sets up a complex adaptive system that is clearly probabilistic.
Yeah, well, I'm really impressed with the way you responded, and I appreciate the nuance and the ability to really think about it critically, because I find so often in conversation circles I end up in that people do not think about the genetic interface with personality critically. So I appreciate your response.
Well, I mean, it brings up my basic passion, which my fundamental passion is that psychology has failed us horribly at one level. And I know I love the field and I love the people in it. But my basic argument is that the emergence of modern science, okay, really the tree of knowledge it's a theory of what scientific knowledge could be rather than really what it is. What it is actually, if I bring back the share screen, this right here really is what psychology actually currently is. And what I mean by that is actually natural science from Galileo and Descartes and then into Newton and Newton physics helped us create a framework of understanding the matter dimension, okay? And we built up on that in relationship to, we figured out how chemicals work. We built out on that to the stars. We built it in terms of cannonballs. And then Einstein comes along and we built it down to general relativity into the Big Bang and mechanics into the fundamental base of the really weird shit that quantum things do, okay? And so the science of physics is a really mature knowledge system. And although it's actually shaky in some places, they have a chemistry into biology is actually a reasonably coherent knowledge system, okay? What do I mean by that? Biologists generally agree that you got cell theory, in other words, understanding biological organisms and their primary unit of organization are cells, and this is the way cells are organized and how they replicate. You have genetics, which is basically, this is your information computational control system and the way it's transmitted through the generations. And you have evolution by natural selection, okay? And together that provides, there's some missing pieces, I believe, But it provides an outline in biology. Very few people dispute whether biology is a real science. Okay.
You'd be surprised if you go to the same schools I've been to.
Okay, well, some people argue.
I'm just being a smartass.
No, well, certainly the physicists and the chemists will bitch about it, and biologists will sort of bitch. But we, psychologists, we have biological, chemical, and physical envy through our wazoo, and the reason fundamentally is because we can't even tell you, like we started this program, what the mental processes and behavioral. Okay.
Yes.
So and then somebody will tell me, well, but biologists can't really define life. And my point of it is that's not the same thing. Biologists, everyone knows that a bacterial cell is alive and a tree is alive and it gives rise to, and ultimately animals evolve, and that biological behavior is what we're talking about. Okay. Mm-hmm. We can't talk about are we talking about mind, or are we talking about behavior, or are we talking about mind and behavior? Biologists don't talk about, well, we're talking about life and behavioral processes. What the fuck is that? I don't know what that.
Right.
It's living behavioral processes. Life is the set of the living behavioral processes. We, they're the cognitivists and the behaviorists and the analysts and all. It's a nightmare. Okay. We can't even get a basic definitional system. That's why the graph shows it's a fundamental breakdown. All right.
Yes.
Science, modern natural empirical science, the shit of Galileo to Newton into Einstein, was completely, it doesn't provide a descriptive language system that's up to the task of talking about mind and consciousness. And that's a fundamental breakdown. So what you get trained as, okay, it just happened to my son. He went through 101. He's like, well, psychology is the science of mental behavioral process. The key word is science. We ask scientific questions, and now all the kids nod and smile, and the key question is nature nurture. Now everyone's nodding along,
right?
Background going, you're just basically lying to these people.
Right.
Nightmare, it's like they don't know what they're talking about. Okay,
that's so well put. Sorry, I interrupted. I thought you were
fine.
So if you were going to teach the psychology one-on-one class, in a way that was much more appropriate to an education in psychology, how would you open up? Because I'd really love to hear.
Right. Well, I go in, I've been guest lecture sometimes. I say, forgive the language. My first line is actually, nobody knows what the fuck psychology is.
I love it.
That's my first line.
At least you're honest.
Then I basically will, more depending on the angle I take, I show the graph, this thing, I'll bring it back up. Okay. And I'll basically say, everyone has this notion of physics, biology, then there's this psychological thing, and then sociology or the social sciences are above it. Okay.
Yes.
So, and then the question is, well, and then you have options, and Skinner and Freud are some of the most influential and most also diametrically opposed, at least in American psychology, operate. And I say, what you will get is this idea that psychology is this thing that asks scientific questions about whatever behavior and mental processes are. And then you'll be given 6 or 7 major perspectives: the evolutionary perspective, okay, the cognitive, the behavioral, the humanistic, the psychodynamic, the systems and social multicultural perspectives.
Right.
Okay? And then you say, hey, all of these work together and they complement each other. And now we're off, and now we're going to go and talk about and then they'll just line out the topic areas. Okay.
Right.
So what I say is, I'm interested in, let's say, human psychology. Okay. And human psychology, I'm interested in then how you are as a human entity. And then now as a human psychologist, I want to understand you. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you concepts, all right, that then should apply to you if they have what I call qualitative generalizability. Qualitative generalizability refers to the fact that actually, if we get these concepts right, a reflective individual can identify what it is that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Okay? All right. So the first thing I say is actually mental processes. That's a very confusing term. What do you mean by that? Okay? I want to suggest to you that there's actually 3 different kinds or domains of mental process. And it's very, very important that we break these 3 domains up so that you can understand your psychology, okay, as a human psychology. And let's see if this fits with your qualitative experience, okay? So the first is that what's called neurocognitive functionalism. I'll break that down for you, okay? this is the idea. Nervous system is an information processing system. First, that's what I mean by neurocognitive. Okay. By functionalist, I mean that what it does is it functions to coordinate your behavior. Okay. So that you have what you do, you have a doing mind. This is at your base. Okay. It coordinates your behavior and it's regulated by your nervous system. Okay. Which organizes your, so when you go to sleep, for instance, and you roll over from one side to another side in the middle of the night, your doing mind is computing that you're uncomfortable, although you're not feeling it, okay, and then adjusting accordingly. Mm. And in fact, a lot of your day, you'll realize that actually the way you walk, okay, anything that you learn to do procedurally, you download into your doing mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's your mind one. That's your behavioral investment mind one, which basically is you have a nervous system that coordinates your system of behavioral investment. It's something that we share with jellyfish up into simple planaria and maybe the insects too. Okay. All right. So that's the first thing. That's one domain of mental process. And you can study this from a behavioral neuroscience, a cognitive behavioral neuroscience view and study animal behavior this way. Okay. Mm-hmm. Domain two, subjective phenomenology. Okay, what the hell is that? Subjective phenomenology is the view from behind your eyes. Okay, your conscious, unique version of reality. Okay, it's called the interior epistemological view. Epistemology is how you know shit. This is the from inside. All right, okay. Now, subjective phenomenology is really weird because on the one hand, it's really the only way we get shit into our knowledge, empirical knowledge system. It's the witnessing function that brings our own consciousness, its knowledge at an explicit level of sensation. And at the same time, no one else can see directly anybody else's witnessing function. Okay? You can't take a camera and look at your shit. We try to look inside your head, we just get a brain and we see the neurocognitive functionalist processes, but we never see the subjective phenomenology process. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so that's mind two. You have a subjective phenomenological mental process by which we were now referring to the first person experience of being.
Right.
Okay? Finally, as a human, you have mind three. Mind three is your justifying mind. That's your self-conscious narrator. Okay? And whereas your doing mind is out here and in your nervous system, and your subconscious mind is in, which means it's accessible by a third person exterior view. We can take a video of your brain system. We can see how it evolves while you're processing information. We can just see what the shit you do, okay, with a video. But we can never see your mind too with a video camera, okay? We can only infer it. But with mind three goes right in between into your subjective. That's what talking is. That's what we're doing right now. It exists both inside and out.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the first thing that I would do is basically let's talk about mental processes, okay?
Yes, brilliant.
One of mental behavior, and that's what your nervous system is doing, and it coordinates your action. Mind two is your subjective phenomenology, and mind three is your talking mind that's inside and out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
absolutely.
If you can see that, all right, now we're actually working. You and I now have done a lot more than psychology's done in 100 fucking years. We actually now have a definitional mind system, all right, we can actually agree on. And now we
that's great.
Okay. Rather than Psych 101, oh, it's the science. Trust me, it's just about a science. You're actually already screwed because if you actually then pay attention to the next phase, you'll see that what is science? Science commits to an external point of view. Science is an external viewpoint. So it all of a sudden now has all these fucking problems in dealing with first person view because we can't really know what your consciousness is. And then you get all these different problems with behaviors, just pretend it doesn't exist basically. And the cognitive, it's a nightmare. Okay. So they tangle up scientific epistemology with a map of the way mental processes should be.
Right. Got it.
By the way, I meant to throw in earlier that like you made a couple assumptions about me when you were talking, and I just wanted to let everyone know you were right. Like while my parents are completely sane, the mad gene obviously runs through the Black family and has for generations. Also, that it didn't express itself until I was hit by a bus crossing the street. And so, while I certainly was not a normal individual before, I was not bipolar. I just wanted to point out that that to add that validation to everything you were saying, that in my own personal experience, everything you assumed about me was absolutely right.
Oh, well, cool. That certainly isn't always the case, but it's nice when it is.
And there's also a factor I read about in Kevin Mitchell's book, who's a neurogeneticist guy. And he said that there's like, and you'll know this obviously, but just for everyone out there, there's a bunch of new mutations that neither parents will have that can also introduce new effects to the person, the personality, the health. And typically they're deleterious. They're not typically helpful mutations, although rarely they can be. I just wanted to throw that in there. I think that's important.
No, it is, absolutely. It's the nature of the evolutionary beast, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Man, I love the way your brain works. It's so refreshing to see someone who's able to hold these complex systems and to see through to the core of the value of each of them, but to also come out of it with discernment and say, no, like we need to pick what's valuable, and we need to find a way that there's coherence between these different valuable ideas. And then the question that comes along with that complement is, how in the hell do you discern what to throw away when you're picking through different theories? Yeah. Is that a scientific approach? Do you ultimately have to come up with your own opinionated decision, or how do you go through that process?
Okay, so there are a lot of different ways to think about that. But what I would say is, for me, the way my mind works is it's coherence from meta levels. Okay, so I'm a meta level coherentist. Okay, which means that I jump back and then try to take a picture of what it is that's going in, and I seek coherence in relation. That's just where that's my intuitive gift, talent, tendency. Okay?
And let me just make sure I understand that real quick, because I think that you make sure that the ideas that you're putting together have compatibility.
Yeah, exactly.
That's simple, right? Got it.
Right. So there are a couple of key ideas about truth. One is like, what are your foundational assumptions, and do you need them to be absolutely certain? In fact, René Descartes was a famous foundationalist. I'm not a foundationalist assumptionist, but that's a key way of thinking. Then there's correspondence theory. Okay, so this is like, if you have a model, how well does it correspond? That's the primary scientific method of truth. And then there's a philosophical tradition also of coherence. Okay, which is, to what extent is there an appropriate logic relation between the concepts? All right. And then to what extent do they cohere together to give you a sense of understanding? Okay. So all of those are very valuable, as is William James's pragmatic, but my tendency is a meta view. So I step outside the stream, like a classic metaphor of that I've used before, and many people do take a meta, is the old blind men and the elephant. Okay, have you heard that parable? Yeah. There's 6 blind men come across the elephant. One grabs a leg and says it's a tree trunk. Somebody grabs a tusk and says it's a spear, so forth. Okay, so I'm an elephant viewer. I'm always like, okay, and yes. I have a good talent to discern the elephant. And when you discern the elephant, then the pieces of the puzzle cohere. They fall into place and integrate. Okay,
beautiful.
A lot of the stuff then just becomes detritus, and then if you're doing it well, then the shit you had an intuitive sense of, yeah, that's a shadow. That's not part of the elephant. That's a shitty shadow. Then that falls away, and you extract the elephant and you see the whole.
Right. Got it. And then if you find contradictions, then you have to reason your way through that and figure out, where did I go wrong? How did this happen?
Exactly. And I was very fortunate in the sense that I started this journey, and it was all chaotic in the mid 1990s. Cleaving this point about justification was unbelievably important. Okay, I mean, it's 20 fucking years ago, so it's been a long time for me to develop this. All right, but cleave this point about justification, and then once you have that, my ability to see meta from where everyone's a justifier. We're all fucking justifiers.
Right.
I'm on sort of the outside of that. Okay, and that was great. And for 6 months, I'm really climbing this, and then I take this hyper shot with the tree of knowledge. And I jump out into a meta loop of basically the cosmos. And the tree of knowledge is this meta quasi, I mean, not to be grandiose about it, but essentially tries to take a God's eye view of science. Okay. And then it's like, whoa, there's a new perspective. And with the cleaving of the human off the rest of it, and then then I came in, worked a hell of a lot on that behavioral investment theory thing, trying to get that sorted out. I had a lot of fucking contradictions in there, and then it popped, and then boom, you get this whole damn system. It's a totally new way of organizing the field, and then all the cool pieces start to connect together and they cohere.
I have a question. How has this understanding affected your second mind, your phenomenological experience of life? This understanding, how has that changed life for you? And also, like, to tie it then in on an individual level to sort of the meaning crisis. Has this helped you solve it for yourself? And as opposed to all the deep concepts, are there any simple life lessons? Like, are there any ways you live differently because of this?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, this is, so this is a, listen, folks, you think you step outside and you do this kind of thing and shit changes you, this is a hell, everyone who knows me, I tell this story, I love my wife dearly, but to give you an idea about where I was and what this did to my soul, okay, is it's 1998, 1999 in terms of, and my wife's pregnant with our first child, okay, and she's going to give birth in July, and I'm going away to a conference, okay, and it's like, well, I'll be home in time, it's about 7 months still had, and then she made a comment. She was like, well, Jesus, what if the plane goes down, okay, and what do I say? I said, my ideas, okay. Now, in other words, at 1997, when I'd stumbled on these ideas, my wife is pregnant and I'm going down, no one's going to know about my ideas. So I had fused what these things were and what they meant to me. And everybody knows I've been changed by them. I mean, there's a whole, I can go into this, we can have another conversation. But there's in fact, I've cultivated a different personality, actually using some medicinal herbs, actually to cultivate a mindset that essentially my wife calls them the knowledge archaeologist. Okay, so the knowledge archaeologist, I take some herb, and then what will happen is my logical structure will come unloosened. So my left hemisphere interpretive structure, all right, my verbal comprehension structure will drop a level of its regulation. And my phenomenological system will open up a level of its association. Okay, so phenomenology is this big picture kind of thing. And then this is a regulatory logic structure. So normally it operates out here. So it's filtering out lots of associative bullshit that this other mind is seeing, which is damn good, because if you don't have that imbalance, people get unbelievably loose and they believe anything and they get gullible and they think crazy, stupid ideas are actually brilliant. Okay, so this regulatory left hemisphere does a very important thing. But as everybody knows, it can also become a damn tyrant, okay? So you need to have balance. So what I realized is the creative side of me came out, and I could then engage in weekly practice, Friday, Saturday night, or whatever, for 2 hours, and my kids would learn, daddy's work on Friday, Saturday night from 8 to 10. And what I would do, basically, is I would then situate myself with a pretty systematic routine, and I would then metabolize the week's conversations, work, insight through a lowered rational structure and a phenomenological exploratory structure, okay? And the loosening of that association would allow me to see shit I would never, so for, I'll just be, I have stacks of papers, just for 20 years of stacks of papers.
Wow.
For allowing me just to trail. A lot of it is bullshit, okay? Because you just have an association, and then the next day you're like, oh, that's shit. But there are a lot of diamonds, I built this entire system of the tree of knowledge, which, by the way, the first branch on that system back there is the tree of knowledge, okay? That's the tree theory of knowledge, which is different than this is entire layered cathedral or archaeological dig, as it were. So in terms of creating a structure for myself, and when I'm in that mindset, I'm pretty intense now. I'm very intense in that mindset. Okay, when I'm in my mindset, I'm a laser focus. I can come across kind of as an arrogant ass, and so my wife will have to regulate me there. that, you know, because that's actually when I'm riding the wave of the top of the tree of knowledge.
Yes.
It's called riding the wave, all right? And cultivating my garden. And when I'm doing,
Beautiful.
I'm doing my thing. And actually that brings us back to a very key point that we're talking about. You talked about the meaning crisis. Okay, let's situate ourselves a little bit in the meaning crisis. Okay. So, all right. So if we're following John Vervaeke, I think is brilliant. I love John, but wonderful that I've gotten connections with him. I'm gonna be able to have some monthly conversations with him.
That's great.
Integrated model of cognitive science and my unified. I mean, the correspondences are really, really powerful and good. And I hope that the converging validity, I think over the next year, folks are going to be able to see is it's going to be like, whoa, okay, this is, you know, shit, you know, and we are, I think we're on the cusp. My fantasy, my hope, my dream is that we're on the cusp of an Enlightenment 2.0 here, okay? And the Enlightenment 2.0 will involve putting psychology and the social sciences on top of the physical and biological sciences with coherence and with clarity about our humanistic need. Right. That's what the dream is, okay? All right. So what happened to me pretty shortly after the Tree of Knowledge was, you know, in 1997, I sketched it out. And John mentioned, or I mentioned this and somebody found it. It's called The 11th Problem of Consciousness. And there's a 2-part blog that John Vervaeke and I co-authored. And the second part tells the story of the Tree of Knowledge and how that transformed me when I actually drew it out. I drew it out in 30 seconds. It's like, boom. It's like I'd known it my whole life. I drew it out and I was like, holy, you know, I was like, what the fuck? And, you know, I was like, what is this thing? You know, and it went through every one cell fiber in my body. I actually hid it. It was so real to me that I thought when somebody else saw this thing, they would be able to just instantaneously see that this was the equation for the universe. That's how real it was. So I actually hid it and said, don't use or reproduce without my permission. Then I realized I couldn't fucking give the thing away. Wow. Well, but now, you know, it's coming back. Anyway, I've always known instantaneously knew what it was. Then very shortly after I discovered it, I realized something about it that's very relevant for where we are now 20 years later. Okay, so let's bring it back. I'll bring back the diagram. All right. Okay. All right. So let's remember the kairos of the moment that we're in. Let's think about the meaning crisis and let's think about where we are. And it's basically the case that everybody's in this game B meta-modern territory. It's sort of like there's something going on with civilization, right? There's something wacky happening. And the 21st century is going to look different than the 20th century. And I don't know what the hell that is, but I feel that. That's okay. And well, I felt that since 1997 that this is going to be coming. So I've been preparing for this in certain ways, and I've actually felt the acceleration over the last 2 years, and obviously everyone's felt it for the last or whatever since March, and the awareness of Jesus, what is this interconnected world that we're living in? And of course the virus is now going to accelerate transformation. Hopefully not transformation into hell. I mean, what we want to have is transformation into heaven on earth. Okay. All right. So now let's think about why did I know. Right after I built this, within weeks, I saw something was happening, and I knew the 21st century was going to be absolutely intense, okay? Well, let's remember what each one of these things are. Okay, so what happens, what each one of these things are is a new plane of existence, so that the difference of life and matter is found in the information processing and communication dynamics of cellular behavioral processes, okay? So information processing, communication between entities, were transformed to create a new complex adaptive plane. Okay. Well, the neuroinformation processing and animal-to-animal communication at the Cambrian explosion happened. All right. And that transformed the world so that the animal mental dimension emerged. Okay. Well, then we had language communicating ourselves networked together. And then when that got hooked into the principle of justification, the explosion of capital C culture happened. And 10,000 years ago, all of a sudden, we're building these systems of justification that gets merged with agriculture. And now you get a sociological explosion and boom. Okay. All right. So now all you need to do is say, well, are there emergent information processing, independent computation systems, and have they gotten networked together? Well, fuck, yeah, actually, that's exactly what happened in the 20th century. Built computers, we built electronic computation, we then built an internet, we networked all that shit together. All right. So essentially what this basically then says is, well, goddamn, basically we are sitting right at the cusp, at the base of the fifth joy point. Okay. We're actually, you asked, well, jellyfish are down here. That's right before mind exploded. And talking apes happened right by here. Before here, that's culture happened. Well, we built an internet and we built an artificial intelligence system, and we're now networking ourselves together. Okay. Well, basically what it means is when I saw this at the 20th century, the next 100 years, this is accelerating so fast if you pay attention to the curve. Okay. And then that's when I realized that other people were seeing this too. It's called the singularity. All right. It's the evolution, the exponential increase of computational power, which ultimately is following in a negentropic line, which actually will reach its limit function. And according to some calculations that are very precise, between 2027 and 2029 is one of the most powerful singularity models, whereby you will reach the limit function of the accelerative evolution of complexity that is on that line that I just showed you. Now that's intense.
Whoa.
Yeah. All right. So what the hell is that singularity? Well, what it is it's the digital social techno interface system. It's the digital social techno interface system that gives rise to the digital landscape. You know, well, shit.
I've been framing the internet itself as a new dimension of reality.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's the nervous system that's getting laid down. What we don't have is the brain yet. So it's like jellyfish with a distributed neural net equivalent that actually then hasn't gotten a centralized control system. And then the fundamental question is, what is the nature of that centralized control system? Okay. If it creates too much chaos, what will happen is we will tip into chaos, and ultimately we can break the whole thing. Obviously, a nuclear war can do that. We short out the system and kill ourselves that way. A plague, any number of things that are making this very fragile before it gets robustly organized.
Right.
The chaos side of the equation that we better be terrified about. The other terror that we better be aware of is the order side of the equation. And the order side is when somebody authoritarian can see this shit and use this power in an evil way, and then realize how to create when I first read 1984, I was like, how the hell do you go back and gather all those newspapers and shit and rewrite everything? If you know Orwell's story, you know, you have all the people, the ministry of, you know, I was like, that'd be really fucking hard. You know, you'd store some shit in the basement and things like that. Well, now in the internet age, that's not hard at all, right? They can do it. If you had absolute control over the internet, you just create whatever the fuck information for people to believe. Okay, which basically means that as we get a high weight onto this thing, if there's a hierarchical, nasty control system, we could just get plugged in and be zombies connected to it. It'd be a nightmare. Our true systems would just be a virtual reality hell.
Isn't China kind of heading in that direction with the way
well,
they're
that's of course. I mean, that's certainly the fear is that a top-down kind of centralized control system will basically create a centralized authoritarian and turn everybody into little zombies that are connected to the internet, following one virtual reality. That's, of course, the Matrix, you know, following one virtual reality that you're then, obviously the Matrix is a robotic thing, but it's the same basic principle. You're plugged into something that you think is real, and it's just some virtual reality that somebody's spoon feeding you. You know, what a nightmare.
Yeah. The other thing I've noticed for myself from a phenomenological basis is that I actually, when I do a cleanse from the technology, I actually tune in to more of my purpose and my connection. And then when I come back, I'm able to use it in more of a resourceful way. But I found it really important to not be constantly on an interface.
Please, say that to everybody. I mean, so this is drawing our attention in a very dangerous way. It's a potential drug. It clicks our dopamine systems in particular ways. And this is not the system we evolved in. We were supposed to be sitting around a fucking fire talking about the hunt and hanging out with our kids and families and our communities on a goddamn plane. This is very different, okay?
Right.
And the digital screen world is a whole nother layer of difference. So we have a huge problem, which is how the hell are we actually going to end an opportunity? Which basically is, what is our human nature, okay? What is a wise articulation of our human nature in relationship to the other, in relationship to the world, Mother Earth? How do we cultivate Mother Earth as the emerging digital landscape happens? So what's the meaning crisis? The meaning crisis is how do we stay wise and create an ecology of psychological practices, okay? Cultivate wisdom as the digital technological system landscape emerges, and we maintain of transition with our institutional technologies and Mother Earth and our relationships between nations in a way that's relatively harmonized and allows that to happen. That's the fifth joint point needle we need to thread. Okay, so we better unplug. We better have wisdom, or else, these powers. These are the powers of gods out here that we're fooling around with. The digital world's the power of gods. If we have the wisdom of children, we are fucked. Okay,
right.
The gods and children do not mix, and we're going to get our ass kicked. Okay, we're already vulnerable, and that's why we better have the wisdom of the gods if we actually have the power of the gods. Okay, and that's what why is that a garden back there? It's a garden of Atua, which is a reference to the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
How do we actually hold the tree of knowledge, and how do we eat off the tree in a particular kind of way that actually allows us to understand good and evil and allows us to orient towards the wisdom of the ages.
Yeah. Wow. I got the chills while you were speaking because it feels so epic and big and important what you're saying. This is like the meaning crisis. This is at the crux of what individual souls have to wrestle with in this day and age. It's huge. I can't explain the wave of emotion that came over me while you were speaking properly, but it's really immense.
Well, that's a soul to soul connection, brother. I've been living that for 20 fucking years. So.
Yeah, I felt the same thing, and it was really nice because, like, for me, from all the mystical nonsense I'm into, I have like a very similar view of life, it seems, to you and what's going on right now. And it's so nice to hear it coming from that opposite polarity of a person who's very grounded and because I'm not doing all that sort of comparative research that you're doing. I'm much more being Taoist and mystical and all of that nonsense. And so if you ever want to participate in a shamanic practice together, I would love that, because you're so much fun like this. So if a little bit of plant medicine makes you more, I'm a psychopomp, and if you ever want to go exploring other worlds with me, just let me know.
All right. Well, listen, I'm definitely open, and this is so right. This is a 20-year project, and the time is now. So I'm basically coming out, and basically I've been fooling around with the institution of psychology, okay, for up until like 2015. I didn't really have appreciation for the blue church frame of reference. I was like, the system will be able to see what the hell this is, but actually I then realized up at about 2015, I was like, actually no, the system is actually the inertia of inside the field of psychology, okay, is in the power structures that allow justification systems to emerge and then get structured. There's just no space for this kind of frame of reference, because individuals will tell me, oh my God, that's really cool. But there's actually no institutional way to coordinate the response to it. So it just dies on the vine. It's really interesting. Okay. And then I got in actually some significant fights with my program, because my program and some of the students in it, modern practice psychology is embedded in a postmodern, kind of world. And I'm a meta-modern thinker, okay? So I care enormously about social justice issues, but I don't play I'm just playing a totally different game. So I come across as, well, yes, as a white man at 27, I built this unbelievable theory and I'm super smart and blah, blah, blah. And that just was oil and water kind of dynamic.
Right.
And then we kept having clashes, and I moved off. For 12 years, I was the director of my program, so I cultivated it. And when I was director, it was one thing, and then I moved. But anyway, what I realized is as I moved out, is like, actually, it's the emerging communities that are shaking loose the blue church assumptions. Okay, that's really, this is the edge of culture, and we are talking about a foundational transformation. So it's at the children. We have to go to you, Ryan. Okay, and we have to take my kids, and we have to take other kids, and help the children realize we are on the cusp of a digital revolution. And if we get the cusp right, okay, wisely, and realize we have an enormous potential. The capitalist structure solved the physical and biological problems, largely, although we killed the earth quasi doing it, but we solved our safety problems, okay? We actually solved a lot of our basic problems, but it caused us to go crazy also. Like our mental health is shit, okay? because we didn't understand psychology. We reduced it to psychiatry, for the love of God.
Oh my God. Yeah. Thank you.
Psychiatry of all things, as if this whole process is some brain mechanism. I mean, give me a fucking break. This is unbelievable.
Right.
Foolishness. But that's the infrastructure. And those are the old, once you get old knowledge structure, the institutional inertia around the blue church is just enormous. Okay.
Wow.
So you got to get out. You got to talk to people who are, I show my kids this and they answer, they live with this. So of course that makes sense that's exactly what this is. I try to show some professors and it's just, well, then what about this? And who do you know this? And who said this? And, there's so much broken background knowledge. It gets all in their way. They can't.
Yeah. Well, I was actually going to add some extra gratitude here, because as someone who studies psychology in graduate school, studying depth psychology at a non-conventional university called Pacifica Graduate Institute, I have not encountered very many thinkers, both in my undergrad and now in my graduate studies, that approach it in the way that you're approaching it. And this is what I'm passionate about, like the stuff that you're talking about, understanding the whole picture. That's why I ask you about genetics. I want to understand the whole picture. I don't want to just understand one side of it. And you're offering something that, for the love of God, I don't know why isn't more available, but I really appreciate it. And it feels like a breath of fresh air to have this conversation.
I'm glad. What happened institutionally to psychology is in the 1950s and 60s, after the cognitive revolution sort of took over, but it isn't a clear model. They took over from the behaviorists, and it was all this, and basically they committed what's called eclectic empiricism. Okay, so empiricism is how do you operationalize your variables, measure, make your hypotheses. In other words, follow the scientific method at the level of hypothesis testing and data collection. So that's the church of psychology, okay, which I grew up on. I took 60 credits. I thought it was great. I love science, but then I started backing up, doing my backup thing. It's like, well, wait a minute. Newton was unbelievably powerful, not just because he did experiments. In fact, when he was unbelievably powerful, is he changed our understanding of inertia. He took René Descartes' Cartesian system. He took Galileo's matter in motion. He realized that he could develop formulas, calculus, that then describe the right variables, and then he mathematically mapped them, and everyone went crazy. But it was his conceptual mapping, okay, of the variables, all right, that made really Newton unbelievably special. Mm-hmm. And psychology, basically, they've gotten to a point where no one can really solve these things, so all you can do is do your operational scientific method. In other words, we're going to parrot the scientific method and act as though we're scientists. And actually, I love a lot of psychologists. I don't mean any disrespect to anybody individual, but that's essentially what the institutional pill, the blue church psychological pill, it swallowed. So you get all of these psychologists, many of them beautiful people doing interesting things, but they're actually already trapped in an empirical epistemology that basically defines what the definition is. And I'm coming off doing something totally different. I'm like, actually, no, you got to jump out to the metaphysical level, define your terms, and then organize. And people are just like, I don't even know how to talk that language. So,
right.
Okay, well, then I'll talk to other people.
Right. Yeah, that's understandable. Well, we've taken up a lot of your time. It's been about an hour and 40 minutes. And, thank you so much. Mercury, do you have anything else you want to add?
Well, not if we're wrapping things up. But on the other,
I have until 6. I blocked off a full 2
hours.
Oh, good. Okay, sorry. I wasn't sure if we were hogging your time.
Now, Mercury said you want the long version. I said, oh yeah, you look like an interesting guy. I'll take 6. I'll take 2 hours.
Let's do it then.
I want to open up then for you to explore. Like, let's just jump to whatever you're excited to explore, and if there's anything that me and Ryan can help, like that you want to talk to us about. Just we're both very open books on the channel.
Sure.
So whether you want to find out more from Ryan about what it's like to be young coming into the field, or if you want to poke around in my chaos a little bit.
Well, I mean, I guess what I would say certainly is I am now interested in making certain connections. Okay. And so I'm reaching out to people, and I'm looking, I reached out to John Vervaeke. I've reached out to Alexander Bard and I are good friends on the intellectual deep web. I've connected with Daniel Goritz of the Metamodern crew. I'm interested in connecting with Jordan Hall and all those folks, and I have good relationship with Zach Stein. So essentially right now, I've been doing this by myself, and now I'm really interested in transitioning. The time is now, and we got about 8 years as far as, 2028 is my, sort of. So I'm looking for individuals. I've built a theory of knowledge listserv. I'd like you both to the theory of knowledge listserv if you want, or anybody else.
Love to be there.
So essentially, my thing is, hey, how do we make this, the bottom line, Ryan, you asked, for people that are receptive to this, okay, everybody has a pretty similar response, which is, holy fuck, why the hell don't we know more about that?
Right.
Okay. So and now actually what's happening is that I'm in a place, and then the system's in a place where that's actually now ready, I think. In other words, the kairos of the moment, the zeitgeist, more and more people are like the size of a big system, the realization of the fifth joint point, when that hits people and they see the line, it's like, yeah, actually, we're right at the base of that thing, and that's really huge. And that's an orienting map, okay? So, that's what I'm here to share with people at one point. The problem that I've had, or a problem, it's not a problem, but, I did that 20 years ago, and I built this entire cathedral around it. It's an unbelievably, multifaceted thing. So when people get exposed to it, it's overwhelming. It's like, well, what the hell is that guy saying? It was a justification. Then there's a matrix thing. Then we talked about behavioral investment. We went to the tree of knowledge. He's got a tree behind him, but he said that's the first branch is the tree. What the?
Right.
So my task is to try to create systems that allow effective digestion at the right zone of proximal development, so people can see the interest and then apply it, so they can then grow and then spread it. That's the other problem. It's so sort of overwhelming. Even my doc students, usually my doc students end up taking one part of it and then really internalizing that, okay? So so I say all that because I'm looking for folks to just, kind of come around, help the process. I really do believe that this system, so like Jordan Hall and John Vervaeke, they talk about, they arrived at the idea of a metapsychological coherence for the ecological practices. I mean, there was their conversation. I'm like, that's exactly what the garden is behind me. It's a metaphorical land, okay, that you enter. That's a unified approach to philosophy that tells you pure and practical reason put together. That's what's behind it. Okay, so it's a tour, and so what I'm here to do is I'm here to share, to learn. I'm learning lots of things from all these cool leading edge of culture people, and then interested in networking and try to figure out ways to make this system available to people in a way that's reasonable and digestible and at the appropriate zone of proximal development. So I'm always looking for feedback from folks on that.
Well, I'm going to order your book, Unified Field Theory. Is that the title, correct?
Actually, it's a new Unified Theory of Psychology, the 2011 book. That's my current. So I've got 3 things that I'm currently working on right now. One is connecting with what I call leading edge of culture folks. Okay. So these are folks that actually get that we're sitting at the cusp of a fifth joint point. All right.
I call it the apocalypse.
Well, it is apocalypse.
We're in an apocalypse right now.
Right. And that can mean lots of different things, as you know. It means lots of different things. But it's a great transformation, whatever it is. It's an apocalypse. Okay. And I believe that. I firmly believe that, I believe that the tree of knowledge is a pathway to the Enlightenment 2.0 that allows us to place science at a bedrock position and then anchor our traditional wisdom and modern wisdom for the future onto that. So that's what then the garden is the representation of wisdom. So the most important word in the garden is wisdom. And so then that's the issue of like, how do we take our knowledge, embody them in values and virtues that enable good living?
Right.
So that's fundamentally. And then the digital, I took Thomas Bjorkman, who I've been in good contact with. He talked about the meta crises of the world we create. I then consolidated the four meta crises, okay, which are, one is the techno-environmental problem, which is capitalism it became an unbelievably great machine and turning Mother Nature into technology, but now Mother Nature's hurting with 7 whatever billion people, okay? So that's the techno-environmental problem. There's a digital globalization problem. Well, that's the emergence of the digital landscape, the fact that our communication information network systems are changing, okay, radically, so we can have this conversation collapsing space and time. Mm-hmm. There's the mental health crisis, all right? Especially in the West, if you look at our youth, the anxiety, depression, alien alienation, loneliness, suicide rate, self-harm rate, not where we want it to be, especially relative to our material wealth. It's unbelievable. And then finally, there's the meaning crisis. Okay, so there's the meaning crisis. We have lost touch with what is true and good. Lost touch with what is true and good.
Mm.
So I want to connect with folks that are seeing, at least, that we're in this meaning crisis, that we have the digital identity crisis. I am launching, I have a listserv called, and a society that I built called the Theory of Knowledge Society, and a listserv. And what that community is, about 100 people. That community, a subset of that community, is starting to launch a well-being community, okay, that are based on a lot of these values and what other commensurate values that people bring. That can start a process of coming together, having respect, having dignity for each other, understanding that there are going to be differences, and then cultivating ways to appropriately create common ground while we recognize difference, all to promote what's called my ultimate justification, which is how do we enhance this being that which enhances dignity, okay, which is a fundamental respect for human well-being with integrity. So those are big three meta values. So my second project, in addition to connecting, is managing the cultivation of the Theory of Knowledge Society and a well-being community called We Thrive. That's the emerging title of that. And then I'm also working on my second book. Okay, so the updated version, which my tentative title is called The Problem of Psychology and Its Metaphysical Solution. So whereas the first book was really concerned with what's called the meta-theoretical problem. Meta-theoretical is above the levels of theory, and how do we take psychodynamic and cognitive and humanistic and put them together at the meta-theoretical? This actually is then one full level above that in abstraction, the metaphysical, which basically is how do you define your terms? Mm-hmm. Remember when we started about how would you start with psychology? Actually, I define behavior and mental process. And I would be very clear with you about what I mean by those terms. Okay, those are a descriptive, it's called a descriptive metaphysical approach, which basically means I'm going to tackle core concepts and categories and tell you how I'm using them. Okay. Mm-hmm. So those are my three projects right now. It's connecting with Leading Edge, getting this word out, fusing with people like John Vervaeke, and others, and helping people figuring out how to convey my stuff in a digestible way, given its complexity. Okay. Cultivating my group and the We Thrive movement and a well-being movement, so that we can show how to create an ecology of practice where people feel known and valued, where they feel they can cultivate their best selves, where they can feel part of a wisdom-based value community that seems reasonable in terms of what might be the way folks live in the 21st century, and articulate my book, which basically says, hey, modern science broke down in terms of its metaphysical way of being able to describe things. It goes reasonably well from physics to chemistry to biology. It breaks down its psychology. I can tell you that very clearly. And here's a metaphysical solution to that problem. And if we do that, we get psychology right and the social sciences, then we can actually have an Enlightenment 2.0, organize our knowledge system, and really build bridges between knowledge and wisdom, and really use that to fuse the growth of our civilizations going forward.
Now,
Brilliant.
I don't understand what you're talking about at the level that Ryan does on the scientific side, obviously. Mm-hmm. But I've been very vocal on the channel about I have an archangel that is mentoring me, I suppose. And it's the archangel that resulted in me doing this channel to begin with. But with this whole idea that it's an apocalypse, when quarantine hit, my archangel told me to step up, and my activity on the channel skyrocketed at that point. And in my communications with my imaginary friends, they said that essentially the big plan that's been going on since before the Big Bang and keeps going, that this was an activation point for me. That, it's been over a decade of training, I've been gearing up, and that it's time for me to get going. And I was told that I will encounter in the near future other midwives of the new age. And just that the entire time you were talking there about what it is you're looking to do right now, I just felt my angel's hand on my shoulder saying very strongly, He's one of the midwives we told you to watch for. And so my crazy nonsense says that upper management's putting me at your disposal.
Okay.
Whatever I can do to help your project.
Mhm.
And I have a feeling that, you know, Ryan probably shares some of that. And so
Absolutely.
consider sorting myself out.
Yeah.
A part of the same project that you have.
Yeah.
We know we're at, I frame it as an apocalypse, and
Mhm.
we want
Yeah.
to do the little bit we can to move us.
Absolutely. So right, we all have our role to play. You know, my imagination takes me to Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You remember? I remember. No. And everyone's seeing the drawing the mountain. You know, some people catch the mountain, right? We're drawing that fucking mountain. You're feeling the mountain. Your archangel's pointing you to the mountain. So I'm seeing the mountain too.
Love it.
So if we can organize people seeing the mountain, well, then the 21st century will be a lot better. Okay. If we fail on the fucking mountain, I am definitely afraid. There are not too many people know where the leading edge of culture is going, but there are some people that are in position to midwife it. That is for sure.
And I think like Jonathan Pajot and Paul Vanderklay and sort of the intellectual light web as well is part of the same thing.
Yeah, I listened to Paul Vanderklay some. He's a really interesting guy. I haven't had any connection with him, but those are the kinds of web weaving that I'm looking to do.
Well, if you ever wanted to, we've talked to Paul before, but if you ever wanted to mix things up a bit, maybe me, you, and Paul could get together sometime.
Sure. No,
I just did a talk with Andrea with the Bangs and Jonathan Pajot. So it was like 3 different people, and that went really well. So if you ever wanted to get together with Paul Vanderklay, I could arrange that.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, that certainly is we'll stay in contact. If you guys want to be put on my list, I'll be happy to put you on my TOK list.
Yes, absolutely.
And you can follow that trail. Let's just web stuff together. And that's what it's all about, man. It's value and connection and communication and working towards what a better future might be as we hold each other in the very, very real, wobbly situation that we are in. But let's do it.
Fucking beautiful.
Yeah, let's make it more. Let's make it what it can be.
Yeah, the other thing that I can really sense about you, Dr. Henriques, is what I've come to know inside of me that I call my soul. I feel a lot of soul coming off of you, a lot of, and for me, this is something that we don't talk about enough in psychology: internal resonance and tracking our meaning, learning how to access that deeper core of being, how to access whatever you want to call intuition or inner knowing. These deeper states of consciousness that I feel like aren't being taught as much as they need to be. And it just kind of radiates off of you that although you have this amazing intellect, I also sense embodiment, and I just wanted to name that.
Brilliant. I'll send you one more. We'll do one more diagram here. Okay. I am. Yeah, I used to not really use the word soul. Okay, but of course, actually, soul is the original word that Aristotle used for psyche.
Yeah.
Interesting. And so the thing for us to be aware of is, but what Aristotle meant was the functional form of your vegetative, sensory, motor animal and rational human life. That's what a soul. Okay. And if we orient the soul to mind too, that subjective phenomenology, and orient to plugging that into the body and give you that your unique Ryan perspective on the world, which nobody else has.
Yeah.
Then we can capture your unique soul that actually is very difficult to understand from a scientific perspective, because it's a third-person inductive general, and you are a unique individual. Okay. So actually, I love the term soul now. And I embrace it in terms of our ideographic, unique way of being. Okay. And what I'll show you here is some of the basic structures images that I have for understanding what we're looking at in relationship to the singularity and how we orient our souls. Okay. So what I believe is coming, if we get this right, all right, is we will build a complex adaptive theory of scientific knowledge of the ontic reality, that's just what's real, and humanistically observing individuals. Okay, in other words, it's a theory of observers observing the observed and doing so for the good of all. It's a scientific humanistic theory. Okay, now,
Wow.
I'm a therapist. Okay, and what that means is I really care about how to connect to people and how we bring the best out of people. Okay, that's what a psychotherapist. So I'm going to connect to you where you are, and then I want to position myself so that you can become who it is that you can become from the origin of your true self. Okay, which is essentially what would be your soul.
Yeah.
In order to do that, you have to align your soul with the idea of the spirit. Okay, the spirit is the ultimate concern. That's the moral aspect of your soul, and the soul is the working through the everyday life. All right. Okay. So essentially, the system that I constructed, all right, sets the stage to understand the scientific reality. There's a thing we haven't talked at all about called the I-quad coin. I don't have any time to get into that. But essentially, it's the way I connect to each individual's unique soul. Okay, that's why it's one. Your I-quadratic experience, which actually just is for your physical, biological, psychological, and social levels, collapsed into one singular. So I-quadratic properties into one unit. All right, that then's organized to the soul, your everyday living, bounced off a relational wisdom understanding, which is the garden, so that we can all achieve alignment with what I call the elephant sun god. So this is remember the metaphor of the elephant?
Yeah.
And how we see it from different perspectives, and I can see the elephant from one, but ultimately it's our ultimate concern of morality. Okay, and that means that we can align scientific behavior with the humanistic concept of soul and spirit and align ourselves for the future good.
God, that's such a great image that you put up on the screen. I'm in love with it.
Well, I'll be happy to send this.
Can we get some of these pictures and graphs and
Absolutely.
stuff?
Yeah,
that would be
absolutely.
fantastic.
It's all available, 100%.
Awesome.
So, okay.
What a ride.
All right. Yeah, absolutely.
I could do this for hours and hours.
That was great.
Yeah.
Good, man. Yeah, man. So yeah, I'll be happy to, round myself back in and making the rounds and prepping my stuff. But time is now. So let's get it rolling.